You're listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast, and this is the Top 5 Constitutional Convention Delegates.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential law. 3, who will the top 5 be? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, let's go without a gun.
Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
And I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
We're coming at you with the Top 5 Constitutional Convention Delegates.
That's just it. Some important figures.
An incredibly important gathering. The Constitutional Convention. We won the Revolutionary War, but we won our independence, but our government, under the Articles of Confederation, just wasn't working out.
That's it.
As far as the central government went, it wasn't much to speak of at all. It had no executive, no judiciary. It was a single House legislature with equal representation for all states. It couldn't tax. It couldn't do much of anything. And a lot of the most influential leaders thought it needed to be replaced.
That's right, James. And that's going to bring us to the Top 5 Constitutional Convention Delegates.
Number 5.
John Dickinson.
Known as the Penman of the Revolution, Dickinson. He was educated in London, owned a plantation in Delaware, practiced law in Philadelphia. His Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, published in 1767 and 68, forcefully argued that Parliament had no power to tax the colonies and were the most influential revolutionary writings in America until Thomas Paine published Common Sense in 1776.
That's right. Dickinson represented Pennsylvania in the First and Second Continental Congresses, supporting a boycott of British goods, but also drafting the 1775 Olive Branch Petition. When reconciliation failed, he supported armed resistance. In July 1776, he argued that independence was premature and that the colonies should first secure a foreign alliance, and abstained from the final vote on independence.
Yep. But he was instrumental in drafting the Articles of Confederation and would serve as a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania militia. He was also the largest slaveholder in Delaware until 1777, when he freed all 37 of his slaves. 1781, he was elected president of Delaware. And then he served as president of Pennsylvania's Executive Council from 1782 to 85.
Quite presidential.
Indeed.
He was chairman of the 1786 Annapolis Convention, which issued the call for the Constitutional Convention the following year, where he would serve as a delegate from Delaware. Dickinson brought a practical approach to the convention and argued against reliance on abstract political theory, saying, quote, "Experience must be our only guide. Reason may mislead us." End quote.
Some delegates believed the new federal government should be purely federal, with its officials chosen by the states. Others believed it should be purely national, with its officials chosen directly by the people.
Power of the people.
This was a momentous question and could either make the national government subservient to the states or the states subservient to the national government. Dickinson found a middle way and proposed a compromise, a mixed government that was partly federal and partly national. One house of Congress would be elected by the people and the other by the states.
That's it. Dickinson admired the British Constitution, and his proposed system would mirror the British Parliament. The popularly elected House of Representatives filled the role of the House of Commons, while senators would be chosen by state legislatures, quote, through such a refining process as will assimilate it as near as may be to the House of Lords, end quote. Dickinson conceived the states as filling the critical institutional role supplied by British baronies, which had stood as a bulwark against an overreaching central government since the time of the Magna Carta. After much debate, the system Dickinson proposed was adopted.
Pretty important. Dickinson also opposed efforts to impose property qualifications on voters for the House of Representatives, stating that he, quote, doubted the policy of interweaving into a Republican Constitution a veneration for wealth. He had always understood that a veneration for poverty and virtue were the objects of Republican encouragement. The convention ended up compromising and stipulating that House voters in each state would have the same qualifications as voters for the most numerous branch of that state's legislature.
Dickinson also supported an executive by committee and unsuccessfully proposed that the president be removable by Congress upon petition of a majority of state legislatures, and that Supreme Court justices be removable by the president upon petition of both houses of Congress.
During the ratification debates, he defended his mixed system in letters written under the pseudonym Fabius, arguing that, quote, a territory of such extent as that of the United States could not be safely and advantageously governed but by a combination of republics, each retaining all the rights of supreme sovereignty, excepting such as ought to be contributed to the Union. To enable the states to retain their sovereignties, they were, quote, represented in a body by themselves with equal suffrage. That's the Senate.
In 1791, he chaired a Delaware convention that drafted a revised state constitution. Thereafter, he retired from public life due to poor health and died in 1808.
Yeah. Pretty important contributions to America, one of our founding fathers.
Indeed, an important figure, and that's going to bring us round to the top 5 Constitutional Convention delegates.
Number 4.
Roger Sherman.
Born in Massachusetts, Roger Sherman was self-educated and worked as a shoemaker before moving to Connecticut, where he became a lawyer despite no formal legal training. He served in the Connecticut colonial legislature and as a Superior Court justice.
He represented Connecticut in the Continental Congress, where he served on the Committee of 5 that drafted the Declaration of Independence.
Pretty important.
That Committee of 5, brother. After the Revolutionary War, he was elected mayor of New Haven, Connecticut, and served as treasurer of Yale College. A contemporary said Sherman was, quote, as cunning as the devil. You may as well catch an eel by the tail. End quote.
Sherman was the second oldest delegate to the Constitutional Convention after Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the most influential delegates as well, because he happened to be a swing voter from a swing state in the convention. The states in the convention voted by state.
Yeah.
Each state's delegation would have to decide how that state was going to vote. And Sherman, his vote often controlled the way Connecticut was going to vote, and Connecticut was often a deciding vote in the convention.
As a signer of the Articles of Confederation, Sherman came to the convention hoping to merely revise the existing government rather than replace it with an entirely new one. At the convention's outset, he voted against a motion on the necessity of strengthening the central government. He opposed a bicameral legislature and supported the one-state, one-vote standard of the Confederation Congress.
But eventually, once he saw that his initial ideas did not have broad support in the convention, he used his position, used his influence to put together the most famous compromise of the convention.
That's it.
When they were deadlocked over two rival proposals for the makeup of the legislature, the Virginia Plan, proposing a bicameral legislature with representation proportional to population in both houses, while the New Jersey Plan, proposing a unicameral legislature with equal representation for each state.
And large states favored the Virginia Plan, while small states favored the New Jersey Plan, fearing that their voices would be drowned out by the large states in a national government based on population alone. This question was critical in determining the relationship of the states to the national government and the balance of power between the states and the people as a whole.
Yeah, Connecticut was a medium-sized state at the time in terms of population, but it lacked unsettled western land. A lot of states had huge claims to western land. Connecticut did not, thus it had little prospect for growth. Sherman had the small state mentality favoring the New Jersey Plan. It was less of a departure from the Articles of Confederation, and he personally was very suspicious of power in the hands of the population at large.
Nevertheless, Sherman saw that the New Jersey Plan was going nowhere, and he proposed a compromise that would preserve some of its spirit. A bicameral legislature in which a House of Representatives would have proportional representation, while a Senate would have equal representation for each state. The so-called Connecticut Compromise was strongly supported by Sherman's fellow Connecticut delegate, future Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth.
However, Sherman's motion for a Senate with equal representation for each state was initially voted down on June 11th, and the convention remained deadlocked on the issue. Eventually, Benjamin Franklin proposed an additional compromise that all revenue bills would have to originate in the House, and then ultimately changes in the makeup of several state delegations as attendance of various delegates shifted over the summer. Some came, some left, and the shakeups eventually produced a majority that voted in favor of the Connecticut Compromise on July 16th. This relieved the deadlock, enabled the convention to move forward. Small states were further protected by an exception to the constitutional amendment process that provides that no state could be deprived of its equal representation in the Senate without its consent.
There you have it.
That point not even up for amendment in the Constitution.
Right.
How important it was to small states.
A pretty huge deal. And Sherman supported legislative supremacy and favored a weak plural executive. He also objected to a proposal that the president be elected directly by the people, arguing that the people were not well informed enough to make a proper choice. When the Electoral College was on the table, the convention was at an impasse over a proposal to have the Senate break Electoral College ties or make a choice when no candidate had a majority. Sherman proposed a compromise that would allow the House to decide, with House delegations voting in blocks by state.
Yep. That ended up being adopted. Sherman also argued that the judiciary would have the power to declare laws unconstitutional, but he opposed the creation of lower federal courts beneath the Supreme Court. He believed that state courts were all they needed, and he also favored having Supreme Court justices be removable by the president upon petition of both houses of Congress.
Sherman spoke in favor of a constitutional provision enabling Congress to assume the state's debts. He just so happened to be a creditor personally holding a large amount of state debt, and he would later be a strong supporter of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's plan for federal assumption of state debt.
What a coincidence.
Indeed.
Following the convention, Sherman was elected to represent Connecticut in the House of Representatives, where he served for 2 years before being chosen to represent Connecticut in the U.S. Senate, where he served about 2 more years until his death in 1793.
That's it. And he was influential throughout the entire founding period, and he is the only person who signed all 4 of the following. 1. The 1774 Continental Association boycotting trade with Britain. 2. The Declaration of Independence. 3. The Articles of Confederation. And 4. The Constitution.
4 very important founding documents.
Absolutely, and his name is on each one of them.
The only name to be on all 4.
That's right.
Another of our lesser-known founding fathers.
That's it, and that's going to bring us to the top 5. What the fuck are we talking about? And that's going to bring us to the top 5 Constitutional Convention delegates.
Number 3.
Gouverneur Morris.
Gouverneur Morris was born into a wealthy New York family and served in New York's legislature at the outset of the Revolution before being elected to represent New York in the Continental Congress. There, he became an advocate for improving the conditions, training, and pay for soldiers in the Continental Army.
That's right. In 1778, during the Conway Cabal, he cast the decisive vote that prevented a no-confidence vote aimed at stripping George Washington of command of the army. In 1779, he was not re-elected because his advocacy of strong central government clashed with the state sovereignty leanings of New York's leaders. Morris moved to Philadelphia and worked as a lawyer and merchant.
In 1780, he was injured in a carriage accident and his left leg was amputated below the knee. He adopted a wooden peg leg, but did not let it hamper his lifestyle. He was witty, charming, and a notorious ladies' man who remained a bachelor until old age and carried on numerous affairs.
That's right. Morris served as assistant to the Confederation government's finance minister, Robert Morris, no relation, before being named as a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention.
Pretty interesting. Starts off in New York, ends up as a Pennsylvania delegate.
That's it.
And he would give 173 speeches during the convention.
That's a lot.
More than any other delegate. Despite having been absent for the entire month of June, he returned at a critical moment with the convention deadlocked on the Connecticut Compromise proposal for equal representation in the Senate. Morris opposed the compromise but argued that the convention misunderstood the purpose of a legislature's upper house, which he claimed should represent the wealthy aristocracy.
That's it. He believed the wealthy should have their own legislative house in order to prevent them from infiltrating and corrupting the popular lower house. An openly aristocratic upper house, he argued, would prompt the lower house to galvanize popular support for the protection of the people against oppression by the wealthy. Quote, by thus combining and setting apart the aristocratic interest, the popular interest will be combined against it. There will be a mutual check and mutual security.
Indeed. He believed that, quote, one interest must be opposed to another interest. Vices, as they exist, must be turned against each other. Now, some delegates believed both houses of Congress should be drawn from the same source so that they would be in harmony with each other, but Morris argued that liberty would be better protected by disharmony between the two houses. He favored making the Senate aristocratic by having senators serve for life and without pay. And while he lost those particular points, the resulting Senate, with its 6-year terms and its election by the state legislatures, would have a somewhat more aristocratic character than the popularly elected House.
Indeed. Morris favored a strong executive and argued that the president would serve as the, quote, guardian of the people. Some delegates believed that a powerful president would be like a king, but Morris argued that the president, quote, is not the king but the prime minister. The people are the king, end quote.
He feared legislative tyranny and advocated that the president be independent from Congress. He supported an absolute veto, a pardon power held exclusively by the president, and an appointment power not requiring Senate confirmation.
When it was under consideration to have the president elected by Congress, Morris believed that such a president should serve for life, as a president dependent upon Congress for re-election could not be independent. He alternately favored presidential election directly by the people for 2-year terms, and without any congressional impeachment power. He argued for no term limits, fearing that either the people would set aside the Constitution to re-elect a popular president, or that an unscrupulous president would subvert the Constitution to secure indefinite power.
A scary thought.
Indeed.
And, of course, there were no term limits for the president in the Constitution until FDR.
That's it.
Morris was one of the few delegates at the convention who spoke openly against slavery, denouncing it as, quote, a nefarious institution and calling it a curse upon the states where it prevailed. He was suspicious of Western expansion, believing that an emerging West would ally with the South to outvote the North, and fearing both the expansion of slavery and the possibility that the West would secede and become a separate country. He successfully opposed constitutional language calling for new states to be admitted on the same terms as existing states, with the terms of new state admission being left an unresolved question in the hands of Congress.
In the convention's final weeks, Morris served on the Committee of Style and Arrangement, which was charged with polishing the convention's work into a final draft. He was the committee's primary writer, with Madison recalling, quote, the finish given to the style and arrangement of the Constitution fairly belongs to the pen of Mr. Morris. A better choice could not have been made, end quote.
Yep, and it was during his Committee of Style work that Morris took it upon himself to single-handedly author the Constitution's preamble. Quote, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Important words.
Governor Morris's words.
Indeed. And he would serve as U.S. Minister to France from 1792 to 94 during the French Revolution's reign of terror. His dispatches informed the Federalist Party's increasingly negative view of revolutionary France. Returning to the U.S., he was elected by New York to fill a vacant U.S. Senate seat, but was defeated for re-election in 1803 amid the rising dominance of the Jeffersonian Republicans. He went on to serve as chairman of the Erie Canal Commission and died in 1916.
It's 1816. He said he died in 1916.
He went on to serve as chairman of the Erie Canal Commission and died in 2016. Is that better? And died in 1816.
Another of our forgotten founding fathers, Governor Morris.
Indeed. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 Constitutional Convention delegates.
Number 2.
James Wilson.
Born and educated in Scotland, James Wilson immigrated to Philadelphia in 1766, where he taught at the University of Pennsylvania and studied law under John Dickinson, number 5 on this list. In 1774, Wilson published an influential pamphlet arguing that all power derived from the people and that therefore the British Parliament could have no authority over the colonies because they were not represented in it.
That's it. Power to the people. In 1776, he was elected to the Continental Congress, where he advocated for independence and was a leader in formulating policy toward France and the Indian tribes. In 1779, after he successfully defended 23 alleged British loyalists against having their property seized, angry rioters marched on his home whilst he barricaded himself inside until city troops rescued him. 6 people would go on to die in the so-called Fort Wilson riot.
Ouch. Wilson was heavily involved in Western land speculation and served as president of the Illinois Wabash Company, which acquired huge tracts of land in Illinois and Indiana.
That's just it, huge tracts of land.
Morris, skeptical of Western expansion. James Wilson, all about it.
That's it. In 1787, Pennsylvania sent him to the Constitutional Convention, where he was one of the most active delegates, speaking 168 times, second only to Gouverneur Morris. Max Farrand, editor of the definitive publication of the convention's records, placed Wilson second in significance only, quote, to Madison and almost on a par with him in the convention, end quote.
Yep, Wilson was the convention's foremost advocate for a strong executive and is considered a leading architect of the presidency. While some favored an executive by committee or a president saddled with an executive council whose assent was needed for most important acts, like many state governors at the time had, Wilson was the first to propose a one-person executive. He argued that executive councils were inefficient and obscured responsibility, as the executive and his counselors could always blame each other when things went wrong.
That's it.
But with a unitary executive, as Harry Truman would put it, the buck stops here.
That's just it. Wilson believed that Americans' fear of political power was influenced by their bad experiences throughout the 1780s, which he contended were caused by the dominance of unchecked and inefficient legislatures. He argued that, quote, an efficient government is the only cure for our political distempers, and that required a powerful executive who was independent of the legislature. He also argued that wariness about executive power stemmed from bad experiences with British colonial governors who were foreigners representing the crown, while a democratically elected president would represent the American people as a whole and would rise above sectional interests.
Wilson was the convention's strongest advocate of broad suffrage, opposing property qualifications and supporting the principle of one man, one vote. He argued that the president and both houses of Congress should be directly elected by the people. He believed that the government's primary function was to educate and improve the people, and that participation in national elections would broaden the people's localized viewpoints and increase their civic virtue by making them more aware of the interdependence of society.
That's right. He believed that democracy would be strengthened by a president directly answerable to the people, and that desire for the people's esteem would incentivize the president to act in the best interests of all. When support was lacking for direct election of the president, with many believing the president should be elected by Congress, Wilson successfully proposed the Electoral College as a compromise.
Pretty nice. Wilson, also a firm believer that the president should be independent of Congress, he argued for an appointment power requiring no congressional consent and an absolute veto that could not be overridden. When support was lacking for an absolute presidential veto, he supported an absolute veto exercised by a Council of Revision consisting of the president and the Supreme Court. Then he supported a presidential veto overridable only by 3/4 of both houses of Congress. Convention, of course, eventually settling on a veto overridable by 2/3 in both houses.
Indeed. Wilson argued that courts would have the power to declare laws unconstitutional and joined with Madison in proposing that Congress be empowered to create lower federal courts. Wilson opposed slavery and later argued that the Constitution laid a foundation to abolish slavery. He proposed the 3/5 compromise to solve the deadlock over the proportional representation of slave states, but disavowed the 3/5 rule later in the convention.
Yep, and in the month following the convention, he made a speech outside Independence Hall in favor of the Constitution's ratification, which was widely reprinted and became very influential in the ratification debates. In 1790, he played a leading role in a convention that redrafted the Pennsylvania state constitution. He became the first professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania and was among America's first legal philosophers.
That's right. In 1789, President Washington appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he served until 1798, when he became the first justice to die in office. He was financially ruined by the bursting of a land speculation bubble in 1796 and endured 2 brief stints in debtor's prison, despite being a member of the Supreme Court.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. Even Supreme Court justices had to sit in debtor's prison.
No one is safe!
Don't you know who I am? I'm James Wilson, a forgotten founding father.
That's it. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 Constitutional Convention delegates.
Number 1.
James Madison.
Founding father that's not forgotten.
That's it.
And as you know...
We know James Madison.
Yep, and our listeners know all about him from our Madison episode. They know that he was born in Virginia, graduated from Princeton, studied law, served in the Virginia state government and the Continental Congress. After the Revolution, he witnessed firsthand the impotence of the central government under the Articles of Confederation and was at the center of a group of influential leaders who sought to replace it with something stronger and more effective. In the Virginia state legislature, he introduced a resolution calling for the 13 states to meet and consider working toward uniformity in their commercial regulations. That resolution led to the 1786 Annapolis Convention, to which only 5 states bothered to send delegates.
But among them were ardent nationalists like Madison and Hamilton, who arranged for that convention to issue a call for another convention to meet in Philadelphia the following year, quote, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Madison was also instrumental in persuading George Washington to attend the convention, and thereby he lends the enormous weight of his name
Very important. Madison arrived in Philadelphia as the most well-prepared delegate, and he has been called, quote, the dominating spirit of the convention. His winning ways, persuasive powers, and command of constitutional principles deeply impressed the other delegates. One of his fellow delegates wrote, quote, in the management of every great question, he evidently took the lead in the convention. He always comes forward as the best informed man on any point in debate. Another fellow delegate wrote, quote, every person seems to acknowledge his greatness. He blends together the profound politician with the scholar.
That's it. Madison had been preparing for this moment for years. At this point, he's read over 200 books sent to him from Europe by Thomas Jefferson, especially studies of confederacies and republics throughout history. Madison wrote a manuscript with entries on each historic example and paid particular attention to how the vices of their constitutions caused their problems. He concluded that a confederacy could not hold together without a strong central government.
Yep, at the outset of the Constitutional Convention, the agenda was set by the so-called Virginia Plan, which was shaped largely by Madison, and based on his ideas, it proposed a government with 3 branches, legislative, executive, judicial, including a bicameral legislature with both houses apportioned by population, that would have the power to legislate, quote, in all cases to which the separate states are incompetent. The initial proposal of the Virginia Plan was also critical because it called for not merely revising the Articles of Confederation, but replacing them outright. And while many of the details of the resulting Constitution differed from the Virginia Plan, its broad outlines were those drawn by Madison.
He argued that this plan would overcome the weaknesses of history's failed republics and confederacies by enlarging the sphere of government. A strong national government could, quote, control the centrifugal tendency of the states, which would otherwise continually fly out of their orbits. The national government would be able to protect minorities within states from persecution by state government majorities, while the national government's large scale, with its great variety of interest groups spread over a vast territory, would prevent any one faction to gain a destabilizing or tyrannical ascendancy.
Yep, Madison ended up not getting his way on a lot of points at the convention. The Virginia Plan had included a limited veto power lodged in a council of revision consisting of the executive and judicial branches. That was not adopted. It also featured a congressional power to veto state laws, which Madison considered, quote, absolutely necessary to prevent the states from evading the national jurisdiction and harassing each other with rival and spiteful measures.
Yeah. While he lost many of the debates that amended the Virginia Plan to allow more state sovereignty, his influence throughout the convention ensured that the Constitution would maintain a balance between federal and state sovereignty, as opposed to the unchecked state sovereignty under the Articles of Confederation that some convention delegates still favored, as reflected by the New Jersey Plan.
Yeah, the convention started off with the Virginia Plan, and then Madison it's like he fought a defensive battle throughout the convention as the convention changed the Virginia Plan in a lot of ways. So in a lot of ways, the convention seems like Madison losing a lot of what he wanted, but that's because it started out with his plan as the basis of debate. He deplored the Connecticut Compromise, which he felt diluted his plan's proportional representation by blending it with the New Jersey Plan's state sovereignty. He wrote to Jefferson at that time that he doubted whether the new Constitution would, quote, effectually answer its national object. But he soldiered on and continued fighting for his ideas.
That's it. He's going to join up with James Wilson in advocating an energetic one-man executive and successfully argues that the new Constitution should be submitted for ratification by special state conventions, not by the state legislatures he distrusted. In the conventions last week's, he serves on the Committee of Style with Morris and Hamilton.
Madison had also taken it upon himself to create a record of the convention. Now, its official secretary recorded only motions and votes, but Madison used a self-invented shorthand to transcribe the speeches. He said, quote, "I was not absent a single day, nor more than a casual fraction of an hour in any day, so that I could not have lost a single speech unless a very short one." His notes are the most complete and valuable historical record of the convention. They were not published until after his death, as he maintained the vow of secrecy that the delegates had agreed to for their internal deliberations.
But wow, what reading they make for now. After the convention, Madison plays a critical role in the ratification debates. He joins with Hamilton and John Jay to publish the Federalist Papers, writing 29 of the 85 essays that explained the proposed Constitution in detail and argued for its adoption. I don't think we can overexpress the importance of the Federalist Papers.
Yep. Considered the greatest and most important work of political theory ever written in America.
And,
if not
amongst
elsewhere.
the most important in history.
Indeed.
Absolutely something. And he's also going to lead the debate at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, and he secures a narrow victory for ratification against a formidable opposition led by none other than Patrick Henry.
Some pretty big names against ratification, but Madison got it done.
Indeed.
He was elected to serve in the House of Representatives and was a leader of the first Congress as it fleshed out the government that was sketched by the Constitution. And to alleviate the biggest objection of the Constitution's opponents, Madison took the initiative in drafting and proposing the amendments that became the Bill of Rights.
That's it.
Because of all these efforts, Madison is justly remembered as the father of the Constitution.
Justly remembered.
Yep.
That is why he's our number one here.
Yeah. But as our list shows, the Constitution had a lot of fathers.
Indeed it did. And it's much more complicated than a lot of people remember it.
Yeah. And yeah, our Constitution is not Madison's Virginia plan, but his role not only in the convention, but in the ratification and the first Congress and the Bill of Rights. All those things put together make him the Constitution's number one father and the number one on this top 5.
That's right. This has been the top 5 Constitutional Convention delegates. I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening.